Nigel Kennedy. Hello. At the height of his career in 1992, Nigel Kennedy controversially announced that he would stop playing classical concerts. There followed almost 5 years of silence and one recording of his own compositions. Last year, Kennedy returned to the concert platform. Critics noted that his virtuoso skills were as bold and exhilarating as ever, and that he'd acquired a new maturity in his playing. At his first concert in London last April, he chose an unusual programme of works by Bach, Bartók and Hendrix, that's Jimi Hendrix. They're now an important part of his repertoire. In this edition of the South Bank Show, Nigel Waters set out to discover Kennedy's reasons for such an eclectic choice of composers. We took him down to Ford Abbey in Dorset to play excerpts from his new concert for this film.
I don't really see any advantage of being any type of musician. I don't think any category is preferable to another because I think categorisation of a musician is already a limitation. And so to be a rock musician, you know, you've still got to, like, do all these mannerisms. You've got to have a cucumber down your pants, you've got to dress in black, you've got to do all these stupid ritualistic things, which are just as unwanted as some of the stupid ritualistic things that classical musicians might have to do.
Nigel, that was simply terrific. Come up to my height now and let me have a word with you. Whoops. Well, now, for a 7-year-old, that was pretty good playing, I think. How long have you been playing the piano?
2 years.
You also play the violin, don't you?
Yes.
And how long have you been playing that?
8 months.
Which one do you prefer?
Violin.
Your grandfather played with Heifetz. Your father was a principal cellist at the RPO. Your mother played the piano, and she was a piano teacher. Looking back, do you think it was inevitable that you became a musician?
You know, I think if you're brought up with a mother teaching the piano and you actually kept under the piano, as I was, I just heard music all the time, even probably before I was born. The vibrations were going into her womb and I was being subject to that. And so music became a very natural language for me at a young age. You know, there's been a few times in my life when I thought maybe I could do something else, but it's only been a really half-baked thought in the back of my mind.
It was you were brought up by your mother and your grandmothers in the house, wasn't
That's
she?
for the first 7 years.
7 years. Your father had they'd split up before you were born.
Right.
Did he have any input into you into your musical career as a child?
Not really, apart from the fact that my mother thought maybe I'd be good at a string instrument.
In 1964, when he was 7, Nigel Kennedy won a scholarship to the Yehudi Menhuin School for Gifted Musicians.
Have you always wanted him to go to a musical school?
Well, since I've known he's really got some talent, I thought he ought to go to one.
I was removed from my family habitat, which was difficult for me to take, because I obviously valued...
Because it was a boarding school, yeah.
It was a boarding school, and I was more I valued obviously more emotionally at that point the contact with my mother and the new family she was starting with my stepfather, which happened at exactly the same time. I did kind of envy the other kids I saw up in Solihull, where my mum and stepdad lived, going to their normal schools, doing the normal things, and it occurred to me that maybe I'd enjoy the more normal type of schooling. It probably would have meant that my career was a little bit less designed towards the making of classical music, and maybe it would have branched out earlier into other types of music.
At the school, he became a pupil of the great concert violinist Yehudi Menhuin.
Thank you, Nigel. That's coming along nicely.
There were some fantastic musical teachers there. I mean, Yehudi himself, being an influence on our way of life, was maybe first and foremost in the respect that even on the Sundays we'd have a different religion read to us every Sunday. He was a man of very Catholic tastes and still is.
And was it from an early age that music to you tended to mean classical music?
Pretty much so. There were two types of music in my household. First was the classical music, which my mother admired and played very well herself and taught to these people who came in the house to learn it. And then there was this other type of music, which included everything else, which if the radio dial got accidentally turned onto that, there was a certain amount of disapproval going on. So there was the classical music and then the other type of music which people disapproved of.
When did you first encounter jazz?
First of all, from my stepfather's collection, where he had records of Louis Armstrong and Kidori and various people like that. And then Yehudi met Stefan, and so I immediately thought, wow, jazz can be played on the violin. And I went and bought these albums of Stefan and Django Reinhardt, the old stuff, and I thought, people are calling this jazz. This isn't jazz. You know, it was some other type of music which seemed to be, to me, to sound a little bit gypsy orientated and some kind of, it was just a different sound altogether, but if people were calling it jazz, that's fine. It was so interesting and kind of a freedom to be able to find this music where the notes that you wanted to play were the right notes and the way that you wanted to play it was the right way, and it helped me trust my instinct in classical music as well. So
it came from a different source. Instead of coming from the page, it came from
your heart and from what your experience was and from listening to the other musicians you're playing with. It was a really great lesson that, you know, in chamber music, if you're playing a Beethoven string quartet, you can't get through this work in a way which does it any justice whatsoever unless you're listening to your colleagues and taking their input. But in classical music, it very often seems that you have to read the notes and that's all you've got to do. And if you play them with a certain technical proficiency, I think maybe a large number of the public think that that's the way you play classical music. But jazz really taught me what classical music is all about, which is call and response. It's really about what other people do and how it affects you and what you do and how that catalyses them into action.
Would you say that Grappelli and Menhuin between them were, at that stage, we're talking about early adolescence, you were very fortunate to have these almost two, I suppose some cod psychologists would say, guiding father figures or whatever?
It was a psychologist could be very useful in this situation. But
Don't look at me.
We all need it. You're Arsenal. You've got the cure for insomnia anyway. but I'd say that it was fantastic to have two mentors in those different fields who almost lived opposite lives. You know, Yehudi'd live the life which was absolutely perfect. You know, you'd have Diana his ever faithful wife there, making sure that everything was perfect, not one hair on his head was out of place. He'd eat the muesli and all of the things which were good for him, whereas like Stefan, he'd just take me around on the day of a gig before he had to get there for sound check, which was really a non-event because he'd turn up after everyone else had done it and then just whinge about the mics when someone hadn't done something right from the box. But we'd go around antique shops all day and he'd say, "I don't like this, we go somewhere else, this is disgusting," in front of the proprietor, and then we'd just walk out and go to another antique shop. We'd turn up there 5 minutes before, have a malt or a brandy or whatever it was that he had, and then just walk on stage and play like an angel. And they both had this particular amazing gift of being able to play a phrase in a totally inimitable way, which was right from the heart and had their, at the same time as being faithful to the spirit of the music, had their fingerprint on it.
When he was 16, Kennedy left the Menhuin School after winning yet another scholarship to the celebrated Julliard Music School in New York.
It was a great place to go in the aspect that it was in New York. Warhol was like active at this point. I was more interested in the jazz aspect of it, but there was all of this other stuff going on. I mean, Julliard I'm a little bit more ambivalent about because everything seemed to be very professionally orientated, and for me, the profession of music is a kind of incidental side effect of being a musician who's devoted to like looking into the artistic thing and getting off on the aesthetic pleasure of it.
You ran into trouble with them because you insisted on playing jazz, is that right?
I had an absolutely wonderful teacher called Dorothy, who's like she was a phenomenal influence on me, but she didn't like this idea of like jazz music coming into it. She said to me, "Look, if you play jazz, then these record company people from a classical part will hear you play it and you'll never get a recording contract in your life." Stefan Grappelli came to New York to play in Carnegie Hall, and he said, "Hey baby, do you want to play?" And I said, "Yeah man, I do, but my teacher says I
You were 16
can't."
or so at
Yeah,
the time,
I was
weren't you?
16 at the point, and like, you know, and I just saw his face, and his face was just so disappointed, and like I'd said something like that to like one of the greatest violinists in the world. I said, "Look, I can't play with you because my teacher says I can't." You know?
Says that she thinks jazz is inferior, which is what you were saying.
Yeah, it's what I was having to tell
So
him.
you're kind of insulting him, weren't
Yeah, I
you?
was insulting him and like also letting down the values like which should have been held in music as far as I was concerned. And like, so I sat there in his dressing room, having told him something really insulting to one of the chief exponents of the instrument, and I got through half a bottle of his scotch, and like went on afterwards and played with him because he'd come back after a second off and says, "Oh please Sherry, let's go on and do this." And so I said, "All right man." And so I went on and played true to form, exactly what my teacher said. There were some Sony like representatives in that hall, classical people who found it fine to spend their money and go and enjoy Stefan Grappelli's playing, but immediately didn't like offer me a contract when they'd been maybe thinking about offering me one.
In 1977, Kennedy left New York to return to England and start his career as a classical musician.
I was being groomed as the next somebody. You know, everyone expected me to either be the next Menhuin in particular, or the next Milstein, or someone else who was, someone else who was well established and recognised. And the Menhuin thing started to be a little bit of a trap for me. So I was being successful.
Because you're imitating his way of playing. I mean.
There was a certain like legacy of things I'd learnt from him, which weren't even conscious, but I did play quite in a similar manner to him in various aspects, and this was a trap which I wasn't aware of, and so I wouldn't say it was a really artistically successful period of my life. It might have been a successful start to my career, but it wasn't an artistically successful time.
still think that, in a way, being British wasn't a great help?
It brings to mind the Beecham phrase, really, which it says, where he said, why do they engage so many third-rate conductors from abroad when we've got so many second-rate conductors of our own? You know, it was a little bit like that. So that was the climate of the time. You know, piano playing was fine. We had people like John Ogden and other people doing really well. But on the violin, it always seemed that it had to be a Russian or someone from a more exotic area of the world. What it made me do is I thought, well, there's only one answer to this, because I can't alter political climates. But what I can do is go home and practice and become even better.
Triple congratulations in order for soloist Nigel Kennedy, because this is actually the third award for this particular recording of Elgar's violin concerto. The record won the concerto section of the Gramophone Awards and the Gramophone Record of the Year.
It was 7 years before he made his first record. It was an instant success. Kennedy soon became one of the best-selling classical artists in Britain. His rebellion against the conventions of classical music, his passion for football, rock and roll haircut, colourful clothes and easy charm earned him regular appearances on chat shows and in the popular press. In 1989, Kennedy's recording of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons became the biggest-selling single-work classical record ever, reaching number 3 in the pop charts. Then in 1992, at the height of his fame, Kennedy announced his retirement from classical playing.
The punk maestro is bowing out on a high note. His live performance of Beethoven's Violin Concerto, released today, earned some of his best reviews.
I'm not cutting out appearing in front of orchestras altogether. I'm just cutting out playing dead guys stuff, because I've done it for 20 years or something.
Nigel Kennedy insists it really is goodbye to the concertos which made him famous and roll over Beethoven.
I got some kind of, I've forgotten what the actual technical name is, a hemangiana or something, where the capillaries all grow together into something, which was due to the pressure of the violin, and it was a totally harmless thing, but I had to have it removed because it might have got infected and then I'd have let down people who had paid for tickets or some scenario like that. So I had to have something done, and I was told by the surgeon that it would only take 2 weeks before I could play again, but eventually it took about 6 months before I could play again, and then it took another 6-month recuperation period to regain the fluidity of technique that I had on the instrument previously. So it put me out for a year, but it also enabled me to identify a few things in my career which I was gradually becoming more and more displeased with, because I'm maybe an old-fashioned musician, I think, you know, in the respect that I don't believe in giving the audience what they want. You know, I think the whole music business is built around giving people what they expect and want, and that's something which I'm totally the opposite of. And I believe in giving people things that they didn't expect and then hope that they want it in the future.
You start your set of pieces that you're presenting with Bartók, unaccompanied violin solo. Sounds like a fiendishly difficult piece, and you come out, there it is. You throw it straight at the audience. Now, can you tell us why you want to start in such a severe manner?
I mean, I'd say it's a kind of love affair with Bartok's music, because I think he's one of the few who's carried on in this century from a line of great musical development through, let's say, Bach, through Mozart to Beethoven to Brahms. But I think it's good to start the particular concert that I'm giving of this type with a work like that, because it's saying, here it is, these are the elements of music which we're going to be looking at during this whole concert. It's an amazing work which Bartok wrote, which is really putting the violin to almost the extreme limits of what it's capable.
Can you tell us why you want to bring these three together? Bach, Bartok and Jimi Hendrix.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got this subscription to the theory that all music is related, or at least all the music that I understand. There's a particular link between Bach and most of the musical developments in the world as we know it in our country and in America, I reckon, because I'd say that Bach is the father of development, obviously in classical music. I see blues and jazz and R&B more as world music rather than black music. I think it's music which has had black exponents and black inspiration, but basically without harmony, which Bach was the chief master of, as far as I know, going back through time. Without harmony, none of the communication of this music could have been possible, and none of the structure of this music could have been made. If you talk to jazz musicians, they say, hey, it goes from a B chord to an A chord to this and that, A7-9, to B half diminished, and so in that respect, I see harmony as being a very vital, integral part of black music, as it's so called. The Bach Chaconne, which I put on this programme, I think is even more pertinent because it's a set of variations which are almost like a set of improvisations by Bach on a dance form rhythm, and so that you have these chords. If I can go and play them on this piano here, you've got this. Which incidentally, you couldn't really write better harmony than that. He's made a perfect harmonical structure for an instrument which is primarily a melodic instrument, and that's what Bach's great gift is for the violin. Which is a fairly standard chaconne rhythm that's it, with it starting on the second beat. 1, 2, 2. Those chords and that little segment is then exposed to these amazing variations which take it into stratospheric realms, which could not be imagined by any other composer. such amazing technically achieved music, but then it's got this spirit which just comes out of there because he's so meticulous with the form that nothing gets in the way. But without the European concept of harmony being involved, jazz wouldn't happen, because that's where the structure comes from. So this impetus keeps this thing going, like for 15 minutes of these most amazing improvisations, like almost like an organ work, really, I'd say. And so the basis of that is very similar to the jazz thing, where you've got a set of chords. So, I mean, you can have a song like Body and Soul, for instance, you know, which is like kind of... that kind of... right? And then on the other hand, you can get someone like Wayne Short to do it. Different chords, and it's like a really, like, a great form of, like, giving a melody some special highlight. Harmony is mood, and mood is a lot to do with music, and I think harmony is very underrated, you know, like in harmony being a combination of notes as opposed to one. And so therefore these variations, I think, then relate to the jazz idioms that we're taking Hendrix into.
One of the things I particularly like about Bartók, which are, as you mentioned earlier, the folk music, the folk roots, the folk things he refers to.
Yeah.
In fact, sounds very like from some of the folk songs are there in the piece as well, aren't they?
Yeah, I think what is beautiful about it is that there is this heritage in his music, and the folk, even in this very theoretical, structural work, the folk, the passion of the folk music still comes through, and also the evidence of it being a work which was composed just at the end of the Second World War by a composer who was dying of bad health in New York alone, and his passion for his homeland still comes out. And it's a very emotional work because of that.
Menhuin gave Bartók the commission to write this piece in order to give him some money without seeming to be patronising.
He wanted Bartók to be able to have this money without losing face, and so he said, please write me something for solo violin. He was obviously a great admirer of Bartók's work anyway, but not even Yehudi could have imagined he'd got such a great work out of this. I mean, I play it slightly differently than the way Menhuin did it, in the respect that Bartók actually wrote the last movement in quarter tones, which is something, you know, you get semitone is the smallest instrument you can get on the piano, and quarter tones are the inflection in between. You know, in many other countries they've got scales which are not based around the well-tempered piano, which means the one which is tuned into the black and white notes and everything. There's notes in between these notes which we might have been led to believe in the West don't exist, and Bartók wrote these and notated them, which is quite interesting to look at. There's something beautiful about the music of the people being put in a form which it'll always be remembered, and also being highlighted. It yet again comes to my love of harmony as a viewpoint on a melody, because if you listen to these Romanian folk dances, which I might just play on the violin, I think, because it's interesting to hear them in their own right. I have to stand up to play these. Is that going to be practical? Actually, keep the jacket. That's worrying everybody, isn't it? I'll sit down. Okay. But I mean, some of these folk melodies, which on their own, you know, they just sound like Hungarian.
Well, that beautiful one and the third one, is it? That's wonderful.
It's amazingly atmospheric.
Yeah.
You know, that is some exotic melody that we would never find in a tavern in England, you know, or Ireland. I mean, I love going around the Irish taverns after the gigs I play over there, and mucking in with and spoiling some of the music which the guys are trying to play in the pub there. Then it goes to other folk melodies which are more typical. That kind of thing, or... What I love about the way Bartók portrays his melodies is that he puts them into an atmosphere which really portrays the background of these melodies, but at the same time as being a totally original view of them. I'd say, you know, if we're thinking about this one, which,
I do love that. I think that's wonderful.
yeah, it's just
Like wind through a stone, isn't it, really?
yeah, it's like, you've got this with the piano, putting it into this, like, almost ethereal world of half light. Whereas in the solo sonata, you've got a similar type of writing where inherent in the melody is the atmosphere. Whereas, like with these folk melodies that I've been playing, the Romanian folk dances, the atmosphere is provided by the accompanying instrument. In the solo sonata, the atmosphere and the melody are incorporated into being the same thing. And that is probably the development which Bartók made over his early days when he wrote the Romanian folk dances to his last compositions, one of which was this folk sonata, solo sonata. You know, you can get a lot of music with amazing technical proficiency, amazing achievement within this music, but the really great composers are able to achieve all of these things, but at the same time still open their hearts and have sensitivity and a nobility and a feeling of inevitability about it. You couldn't change one of these notes and say, hey, that would be better.
And then comes Jimi Hendrix.
And then comes Jimi Hendrix,
Yes.
which is obviously more difficult to demonstrate on the violin alone, but I think there are folk elements in it. And obviously I approach Jimi Hendrix in my own way, in the same way that if you hear Jimi Hendrix playing All Along the Watchtower or Hey Joe, which was a country song originally, it's nothing like how it was originally played in the first place. And so where I'm taking Jimmy is into the way that the things that I find interesting in Jimmy's music, and what I see there is some kind of almost Celtic influence, you know. And if you listen to the folk things that might be evident in his work, I see something like Little Wing, for instance, as being very much like a folk melody. I mean, if you listen to something like the fact that Jimmy was listening to, you know, and taking in all diverse things like R&B and folk idioms of his time and surroundings, and then portraying them in a totally different way is exactly like what Bartók was doing. You know, Bartók takes these folk melodies which I've been playing on the violin alone, and when you hear them in the context of the piano, or you hear the inspiration in the context of the violin solo sonata, it's a totally different thing. And that's what Jimmy did. He took things which could sound very mundane and like normal when you hear them in their normal environment, and he turned it into this magic world. And that's what I really respect and think is the same process going on in his mind and creation as was going on in Bartók's.
Can you tell us a bit more about what you did in the suite that you've done about Jimi Hendrix music?
Well, what I'm really trying to do is, like, because of the compositional aspects of Jimmy's music, which I really admire, I'm trying to shed a new light on these. So really what I'm doing is, in songs like Third Stone from the Sun or A Merman, you know, in 1983, A Merman I Would Be, which I think are two very interesting songs because there's a broad expanse there and a tonal palette which you can use, which he obviously did in his work. I've really deconstructed these songs and put them back together in what might appear to be a very different order, but I'm trying to follow a train of thought which brings the elements which I can hear in this music together. So like in Third Stone from the Sun, I'll build up this kind of sound, which is the background and the palette, I mean there's canvas, and then like apply these different sounds on it with the acoustic violin, and using John Etheridge, who's the guitar player I'm collaborating with on this, like who's a wonderful improvising musician, and I'm really taking it more into the realms of jazz.
Does it worry you that an obvious criticism could be, look, the Hendrix thing was to do with the Hendrix sound. That is a particular electric sound in every sense, that with acoustic instruments you're just not going to get there, so you're going to miss the thing that gave it its visceral value.
Maybe I could see that, but I don't subscribe to that. Obviously, I'm out there doing it, but like I don't subscribe to that point of view in the same way that I don't see why anyone should have got uptight if he took All Along the Watchtower and did it in a totally different way. I'm sure Hey Joe wasn't orchestrated for like major electric guitar and his type of vocals in the first place, and so if he had the license to do it, I wouldn't have thought he would be sitting there now saying, isn't it shocking that someone's doing what Nigel's doing to this music. I think he'd be very bored to hear most of the cover versions of his songs just sounding like he does himself. And what I think is, I think I'm standing up for the merit of his compositions by playing them in a totally different way and giving it the voice of an acoustic instrument. I find also in all of his music, I find is something really beneficial because there's something urgent about the dynamic differential you can get between an acoustic instrument, whether you take it down to an almost inaudible hush, or if you're playing it full throttle and the aggression of the bow grinding against the string. I think it's something equally exciting, or maybe almost equally exciting, as what Jimmy was doing with feedback and stuff. I'm trying to recreate the energy without doing the same thing. You know, anyone can now get a guitar and like recreate feedback on a guitar, but to hear these sounds coming out of an acoustic instrument is really exciting, I think.
see that this mix is setting your course for the future? I mean, this is what this is the path you're on.
I think really just to work off my instrument and try and embrace these elements and bring them together, I think is going to be a large part of my musical future, yeah.